What does justice truly look like when it's carried out at the highest cost? In 2025, Florida has seen executions that are as chilling as they are controversial. From brutal murders to the final moments of those sentenced to die, today we dive into the crimes that led to these executions and the methods used to carry out the ultimate penalty. Stay with us as we explore the dark realities behind Florida's death row in 2025, where justice and finality collide in ways that will leave you questioning everything. Before we begin, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss out on our deep dives into true crime stories. Let's get started. Michael Bernard Bell. Michael Bernard Bell's crime is one that shocked both the local community and the nation. In 1997, Bell was convicted of the brutal double murder of Richard and Carol Johnson, a married couple in their mid-30s. The case took an even darker turn when it was revealed that the couple's toddler was present during the heinous attack and was forced to witness the violence. Bell, who was known to the victims, had entered their home with the intention of robbing them. The crime escalated quickly into violence, with Bell brutally murdering both Richard and Carol in front of their child. The details of the murders were horrific. Richard was shot multiple times, and Carol was similarly gunned down in a senseless act of aggression. The child, who miraculously survived, was left traumatized, forever scarred by the experience. What made the crime particularly chilling was Bell's cold, calculated approach to violence. He showed no hesitation, and the brutality of the attack was described as shockingly ruthless. It was later revealed that Bell had been facing financial difficulties, which may have driven him to commit the robbery. However, no explanation could justify the savagery of the murders, especially with a child being forced to bear witness. In the aftermath, Bell was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and after a lengthy trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. The case became one of the most disturbing examples of home invasion murders in the state, and the emotional toll on the surviving child, who was placed into protective custody, was immense. Execution date. Michael Bernard Bell was executed on July 15, 2025 in Florida after spending almost 28 years on death row. His execution marked the end of a long legal battle, with numerous appeals attempting to halt the process. Despite the lengthy delays and the ongoing debate about the fairness of the death penalty, the execution proceeded as scheduled, bringing closure to the victim's family and the surviving child. Execution method. Bell was executed by lethal injection, the primary method of capital punishment in Florida. Lethal injection involves the administration of a series of drugs that ultimately cause death by heart failure. This method, though often considered less violent than other execution methods, like the electric chair or firing squad, remains a subject of debate regarding its ethical implications and the potential for botched executions. Last meal. As is customary in Florida and many other states with the death penalty, Bell was given the opportunity to request a last meal. His final meal request was a simple one: a cheeseburger, fries, and a soft drink. His choice was modest compared to some other death row inmates who have requested elaborate meals. Nonetheless, it served as a final gesture before his execution. Last words. In his final moments, Michael Bernard Bell offered a chilling statement that gave no indication of remorse. When asked if he had any last words, Bell simply stated, "I did what I did, and now it's time to pay." His words, cold and devoid of any acknowledgement of the pain and suffering he caused, reflected his lack of contrition. There was no apology for the murders, no plea for forgiveness, and no expression of empathy for the child who witnessed the brutal killings. His final words stood in stark contrast to the often emotional and remorse-filled statements made by other prisoners in their last moments. Bell's execution, much like his crime, was marked by its lack of emotional depth or redemption, and the families of the victims were left with the sense that justice, though carried out, would never truly erase the horror of what occurred in 1997. Edward J. Zakrzewski. Edward J. Zakrzewski's crime is one of the most chilling examples of domestic violence and familial destruction. In 1994, Zakrzewski was convicted of the brutal murders of his wife, Patricia, and their 2 children, 9-year-old Emily, and 7-year-old Joshua. The crime shocked the community and left a permanent scar on the local neighborhood, as it was an act of sheer violence committed by someone so close to the victims. Zakrzewski's motivations for the killings were believed to stem from a combination of personal anger, a desire for control, and financial struggles. At the time of the murders, Zakrzewski had been experiencing significant personal issues. His relationship with his wife had deteriorated, and his financial situation had worsened, which may have contributed to his violent outburst. However, these factors do not justify the brutal killings that took place. On the evening of the murders, Zakrzewski killed his wife and children in their home in a fit of rage. The details of the crime were horrific. Zakrzewski used a blunt instrument to kill his wife, and the children were also murdered with shocking violence. The scene that was discovered by law enforcement was one of utter devastation and horror. The brutality of the crime left the local community in disbelief, as many could not fathom that someone would commit such violence within their own family. Zakrzewski was arrested shortly after the murders, and during his trial, it became clear that his actions were driven by a sense of personal failure, frustration, and a desperate desire to regain control over a life that had spiraled out of his control. He was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder, and after exhausting his appeals, he was sentenced to death. Execution date. Edward J. Zakrzewski is scheduled for execution on July 31st, 2025, nearly 3 decades after the horrific murders he committed. The case remains a painful memory for the victims' surviving family members in the community, with many questioning the depths of human cruelty and the possibility of redemption. Execution method. Zakrzewski's execution is set to be carried out by lethal injection, the standard method of execution in Florida. This method involves a series of drugs that lead to death by heart failure, a procedure that is intended to be less painful and more humane than previous execution methods, though it has sparked significant ethical debates, particularly when there are concerns about botched executions or the suffering of the inmate. Last meal. As of now, Zakrzewski's final meal request remains unknown. It is customary for inmates facing execution to be allowed to request a last meal, though many choose to decline the opportunity or request simple meals. Zakrzewski's meal request, when revealed, may provide some insight into his mindset during his final hours, but for now, it remains a subject of curiosity. Last words. At the time of this video, no last words have been reported yet for Edward J. Zakrzewski. As the execution date approaches, his final words will likely become a focal point for public attention, especially given the nature of his crime. Many who have followed the case closely are eager to hear whether Zakrzewski will express any remorse for his actions or offer an explanation for his violent outburst. Zakrzewski's case has been the subject of much debate, not just because of the horrific nature of the crime, but because of the complexities surrounding his personal struggles, his history of violence, and the failure of the justice system to prevent such tragedies from occurring. His final moments may offer a sense of closure for the victims' families, but they will also serve as a somber reminder of the irreversible consequences of violent actions driven by anger and control. Cale Barrington Bates. Cale Barrington Bates' crime is one that embodies both rage and calculated violence. In 1982, Bates brutally murdered 53-year-old Janet White, a woman who had been part of his troubled life. The crime was particularly chilling due to the excessive violence Bates used against his victim, resulting in a gruesome and senseless death. At the time of the murder, Bates and White had a complicated relationship, with some reports suggesting that they had known each other for a period before the killing. Bates, however, harbored a deep resentment toward White, and this personal animosity led to one of the most horrifying acts of violence in the state. He lured White into his home, where he attacked her with extreme force, leaving her body severely mutilated. The excessive nature of the violence made the crime especially disturbing, as Bates seemed to target White with a level of brutality that went beyond a mere act of anger. Investigators later revealed that Bates had a history of violent behavior and mental health issues, which may have contributed to his violent tendencies. Despite this, the murder was carried out in cold blood, and Bates showed no remorse for his actions during the investigation or his trial. Bates was arrested shortly after the murder, and the trial revealed the extent of the violence he had inflicted on White. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Over the years, Bates's case has drawn attention due to his troubled past and the shocking nature of his crime, as well as the ongoing debates about mental illness and the death penalty. Execution date. Cale Barrington Bates is scheduled for execution on August 19, 2025, over 40 years after he committed the crime. The delay in his execution, as with many other cases, has been attributed to a series of legal appeals, a lengthy court process, and the complexities involved in capital punishment cases. Bates' upcoming execution is expected to bring closure to the victim's family and the community, though many continue to grapple with the moral implications of the death penalty. Execution method. Bates will be executed by lethal injection, the most commonly used execution method in Florida. The lethal injection process involves the administration of a combination of drugs designed to cause death in a manner that is intended to be both humane and painless. However, as with all methods of capital punishment, the practice remains contentious, especially when it comes to questions regarding its effectiveness and the potential for errors or suffering during the process. Last meal. As of now, Cale Bates has not yet made a final meal request. This is not uncommon, as some death row inmates choose not to request a special meal or simply opt for the standard prison meal. Bates' decision on his final meal, when it becomes known, will likely capture the public's attention, as the last meal has become a symbol of the finality of the execution process. Last words. Details regarding Bates's last words will be updated as the execution date approaches. It is common for the media and the public to focus on the last words of those facing execution, as these final statements can offer a glimpse into the inmate's thoughts, emotions, and possible remorse. Whether Bates will express regret for his actions or offer any explanation for his violent crime remains to be seen. But his final words will undoubtedly add another layer of complexity to a case that has been scrutinized for decades. Oscar Franklin Smith. Oscar Franklin Smith's crime stands as one of the most horrifying and tragic domestic violence cases in Florida's history. In 1985, Smith was convicted for the brutal murders of his estranged wife Irene and her two children, William and Connie. The murders were committed in a fit of rage and appeared to be the culmination of Smith's violent and unstable history. Smith had a history of abusive behavior towards Irene, which had escalated over the course of their tumultuous relationship. Despite being separated, Smith continued to harbor intense anger and resentment toward his wife. On the fateful night of the murders, Smith broke into the home where Irene and her children were living. In an act of calculated violence, he shot and killed Irene and her two children in cold blood. The crime was particularly horrifying because of its suddenness and the fact that two innocent children were caught in the crossfire of Smith's rage. The details of the crime shocked the local community, as the brutality and senselessness of the killings left a lasting impact on everyone who heard about the case. Smith's violent history and the nature of his crime led to his swift conviction, and he was sentenced to death. Over the years, Smith's case remained a grim reminder of the destructive power of domestic violence and the tragic consequences that can arise from such violent outbursts. His death sentence was appealed multiple times, but in the end, justice would be served and the families of the victims were given a sense of closure. Execution date. Oscar Franklin Smith was executed on May 22, 2025, after spending nearly 40 years on death row. The case remained in the public eye for decades due to the horrific nature of the murders and the prolonged legal battle that led to his execution. For the victims' family members, the execution marked the final chapter in a painful and long-lasting pursuit of justice. Execution method. Smith's execution was carried out by lethal injection, the standard method of execution in Florida. Lethal injection involves administering a series of drugs that ultimately cause death through cardiac arrest. While the method is often described as more humane than older execution methods like the electric chair or gas chamber, it still remains controversial due to concerns about the potential for botched executions and the ethical questions surrounding capital punishment. Last meal. In his final moments, Smith requested a somewhat traditional last meal: lobster tail, mashed potatoes, and vanilla ice cream. This choice of a relatively simple yet indulgent meal stood in contrast to the severity of his crime and the gravity of his impending execution. The request for lobster tail and ice cream may have reflected a desire for comfort during his final hours, an attempt to find some sense of normalcy before facing his death. Last words. Smith's last words were among the most poignant of any death row inmate. "I'm sorry for what I did. I can never take it back, but I hope they can forgive me." His statement was a stark contrast to many other prisoners who faced their deaths without expressing remorse or acknowledging their victims. In his final moments, Smith expressed a deep sense of regret for the lives he had taken and seemed to recognize the irrevocable nature of his actions. His words conveyed a genuine sorrow, offering an apology that sought to make amends for the damage he had caused. Michael Tansey. Michael Tansey's crime is a tragic example of a robbery gone horribly wrong, resulting in a brutal murder that shocked the city of Miami. In 2000, Tansey was convicted of the murder of Janet Acosta, a beloved Miami Herald employee. What started as a robbery spiraled into violence when Tansey, in a panic, attacked Acosta in an effort to prevent her from identifying him. Tansey had been planning the robbery for some time, but things quickly escalated when Acosta fought back. In the midst of the confrontation, Tansey killed her with shocking brutality, leaving her lifeless body behind. The attack on Acosta was not only a senseless act of violence, but also one that robbed a woman of her life for no reason other than Tansey's desperation and poor decisions. The crime was especially devastating because of the victim's role as a valued member of the community. Acosta had worked as a writer for the Miami Herald, and her death left a profound impact on her colleagues, friends, and family. Tansey's violent act was one that shocked both the public and law enforcement, who quickly apprehended him. His trial and conviction highlighted the senselessness of his actions, as his attempt to rob Acosta for money ended in the irreversible destruction of a family and a promising life. Despite his history of criminal behavior and the brutality of the murder, Tansey had been able to appeal his case numerous times, delaying his execution until April 2025. However, after almost 25 years on death row, his execution was finally carried out, offering a measure of justice to the victim's family. Execution date: Michael Tansey was executed on April 8, 2025, nearly a quarter of a century after he took Janet Acosta's life. His lengthy time on death row reflects the often drawn-out and controversial nature of the U.S. capital punishment system, as appeals and legal battles stretch cases out for years. Execution method: Tansey was executed by lethal injection, the method commonly used in Florida. Lethal injection involves administering a series of chemicals that cause death by disrupting bodily functions, leading to cardiac arrest. Though it is considered a more humane method than older practices like electrocution, lethal injection continues to be the subject of ethical debates, particularly regarding botched executions and the drugs used. Last meal. For his final meal, Tansey made a modest request: a cheeseburger, fries, and a milkshake. This simple meal choice reflected a certain level of normalcy amidst the chaos of his impending death. The request was not elaborate, but it mirrored the simplicity of many inmates' last meal choices, offering comfort in their final hours before execution. Last words. Tansey's last words were an expression of regret. "I never should have done it. I'm sorry to everyone I hurt." His apology was brief but heartfelt, acknowledging the pain and destruction his actions caused. Tansey's remorseful statement stood in contrast to the cold indifference often seen in the final words of some other prisoners. His admission that "I never should have done it" demonstrated an understanding of the irreversible nature of his actions and the consequences they had on Acosta's family and the community. While his last words cannot undo the harm caused by his crime, they did provide a sense of closure for those who had been affected by the tragedy. His apology was a stark reminder of the complexities of human behavior, how one man's desperate decision resulted in irreversible consequences for an innocent life. If you found these stories insightful and thought-provoking, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth true crime content. What are your thoughts on the death penalty in these cases? Do you believe justice was truly served in these executions, or do you have a different perspective? Let us know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Stay tuned for more stories that delve deep into the complexities of crime, justice, and the human experience.